Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Oris Statue, and it's an honor to welcome you this evening to the third in our monthly speaker series for 2025, organized by the Ucrainica Research Institute. Today's seminar is the first of two parts commemorating the 75th anniversary of the founding of the League of Ukrainian Canadians, originally called the Canadian League for the Liberation of Ukraine. The second part, the commemorative dinner, is scheduled to take place in the Guild Hall tomorrow evening. I will now introduce our distinguished speakers in the order in which they will speak. We'll have the Q&A period after both have finished. Now about our speakers. First to speak will be Oskar Lozinski, who completed his law studies at Fordham University in 1976 with a Doctor of Law degree. While at university, he was active in Ukrainian student organizations, and for 2 years published the Ukrainian student magazine Phoenix. Later, he headed the Ukrainian Youth Association of America, which prepared him to lead the Ukrainian diaspora in the United States and worldwide as president of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America and president of the Ukrainian World Congress. In recent years, he has written 15 books and many articles on Ukrainian historical and socio-political issues. Our second speaker will be Lyubomir Luchuk, who for many years was a professor at the Royal Military College of Canada. Dr. Luchuk is the author, editor, and co-editor of 32 books and monographs, as well as many opinion editorials published in Canada's leading newspapers. Among his recent publications are Operation Payback, the co-authored volume Enemy Archives, Soviet Counterinsurgency Operations and the Ukrainian Nationalist Movement, and the booklet The Galicia Division, They Fought for Ukraine. He's also a senior research fellow of the Chair of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Toronto. Please give a warm welcome to our distinguished speaker.
Шановні слухачі, I will say a few words in both Ukrainian and English because I feel compelled, in as much as I was born in the United States and came to the United States. I would like to profusely apologize to all Canadians for the idiot that currently occupies the White House. It is true that the United States of America elected him, but that is a very unfortunate occurrence. You may be assured that his popularity in the United States is decreasing as we speak. It's well below 50%. He has managed to alienate not only Canada, he has managed to alienate the entire world. While he was elected for a period of 4 years, he will be at some point neutralized in terms of there are demonstrations and resistance all over the United States as we speak. It's not just the common people, but it's also the people who have financial wherewithal. The stock market has dropped precipitously, and those people who were once relatively rich are now very poor. So, believe me, я хочу вас перепросити, я роджений в Америці, тому я почуваюся до відповідальності. Я ніколи не голосував за Трампом. Я пригадую ще, коли він верховодив нерухомостями в Америці, він був відомий по цілому Нью-Йорку як брехун. Його батько був відомий як це, Я вам представлю один яскравий приклад його брехунства. Недавно був в нього генеральний секретар РУТЕ з НАТО в Білому домі, і він сказав йому, що він за ним голосував. Сказав Дональд Трамп це. А РУТЕ був обраний генеральним секретарем у липні 2024 року, коли Трамп ще не був президентом Америки, і тому не міг за ним голосувати. У кожному випадку, I will get to the point, and first of all, I will do my co-speaker a major favor by stating that one of the best books that he has ever compiled or written is a book which was called Anglo-American Perspectives on the Ukrainian Question, 1938-1951. And I will allow myself to quote from that book. There is a document, there are many documents that refer to the American government, the British government, and there are documents that refer to the Canadian government. There's a document dated May 25th, 1945, which shows very clearly what the position of Canada was at that time towards Ukraine, concepts of Ukrainian independence and the like. The person who wrote this is D. Wilgris, Canadian ambassador to the USSR. It was written to N.A. Robertson, Canadian Undersecretary of State for External Affairs, on Ukrainian-Canadian Committee's protest over repatriation of Ukrainian political refugees to the USSR. With reference, I quote, with reference to the attached telegram from the Ukrainian-Canadian Committee and the representations which you received from Dr. Kushner, I do not think it would be advisable for us to intervene on behalf of the prominent Ukrainians who are likely to fall into the hands of the Soviet authorities as a result of the occupation of Germany. It might be advisable to send a telegram to the High Commissioner for Canada in London asking him to ascertain from the United Kingdom authorities what policy is being followed regarding the handing over to the Russians of Ukrainian nationalists found in the British zone of occupied Germany. The receipt of such information from Mr. Massey might assist us in answering further inquiries or representations which we may receive from the Ukrainian-Canadian Committee. It would be prejudicial, he stresses, to our relations with the Soviet Union if we were to make representations that prominent Ukrainian nationalists should not be handed over to the Soviet authorities. The Soviet government regard these people as fascists, and our interest on behalf of such men would be understood as an unfriendly act towards the Soviet Union. From the purely strict legal point of view, it is also no business of ours what happens to these Ukrainian nationalists, although this could not be very well used in reply to representations submitted to us by the Ukrainian-Canadian Committee. Скоротити це, сказав представник Канади дуже відкрито, що ми не можемо підтримувати справу українських націоналістів, щоб їх не депортували до Радянського Союзу, бо ми є по стороні Радянського Союзу, ми маємо з ними добрі відносини, і це є сьогодні наше становище. Візьміть це, take this, from 1945, and let's move to 1991. In 1991, when Ukraine proclaimed its independence on August 24th, and then it was confirmed or ratified by a referendum is essentially of 90% of the population voting in favor of independence, Canada was either the first or the second country to recognize the independence of Ukraine. The United States was in the hundreds of countries which recognized and did not do so until December 25th, 1991, which would seem to me that if I am to speak today about the third wave, the Ukrainian emigres that arrived after World War II, which was essentially an political immigration, that they did a phenomenal job, right? Because quite a difference. However, the fact remains that much more remains to be done because Canada spends less than 1.5% of its GDP on military aid or military wherewithal. Meaning Canada today is not doing enough to help Ukraine in the current war. The parallels between the Ukrainian community in the United States and Canada they're astonishing. Essentially, the first wave came about in the same time in the United States in the final quarter of the 19th century, in Canada close to the beginning of the 20th century. The first settlers settled in Western Canada. The first settlers in the United States settled in the coal mines regions of Pennsylvania. The first settlers were economic immigrants for both America and Canada. However, it would be wrong to attribute the politicization of the Ukrainian community in Canada or the United States strictly to those who came after World War II. Because not only did the pioneers, they built churches, they formed organizations, they also had a political mantra. There were numerous political organizations, such as the Hetmanchi. You had a political organization such as the Ukrainian the Federation of Ukrainian Organizations, or UNO, which was essentially a descendant or a successor of the Bratstvo Strelcів, which was formed in Canada, such as ODVU, ODVU was created in the United States by Polkovnik Evhen Konovaltsyev. The Canadian-Ukrainian community became politicized between the two world wars, because the second wave, which we refer to, which came between the two world wars, was to a great degree political. In addition to Konovalets, there were people that came from eastern Ukraine, the Ukrainian National Republic. You had the Hetmanchi, as I had mentioned earlier. There was a government in exile. So these people were much more politicized than the first generation, but certainly not as much as the third wave, which came after the war. There was a negative aspect to the politicization of the Ukrainian community in Canada. You had an organization known as TUAC. I'm sure you've heard of that organization. Let me read to you a letter that was written by a member of TUAC to a newspaper, a news from Ukraine, in Ukraine. His name was Alex Sokolovsky. He was from Windsor, Canada. He sent congratulations to a newspaper known as news from Ukraine. On the occasion of the 30th anniversary of liberation from hated communism, this was in 1975, he wrote this to the Soviet government. We, the progressive Ukrainian community in Windsor, send our best wishes to Ukrainians and all Soviet people. We wish you all the best in your noble activities for the benefit of peace and brotherhood among nations throughout the world, members of the Windsor branch of the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians, and so forth and so on. There was a similar structure in the United States. You probably have heard of a gentleman, and I use that phrase very loosely, named Michael Hanushak, who published a book known as Lest We Forget, who was an avowed member of the Communist Party. He was active in the, not Ukrainian-American community, but in the American community. He published a book calling all the people who came after the Second World War fascist, Nazi collaborators, and so on, and so forth and so on. We had the Americans meeting. In America, we had our own fringe group. So what transpired is that in both Canada and in the United States, the overwhelming force that took control, in essence, and molded the mind of that community was that immigration that arrived after the Second World War, the third wave. We are observing today and tomorrow the 75th anniversary of the League for the Liberation of Ukraine, Liga Ucrainica-Standing. They were formed in 1949, but there had previously been UNO, which was a very similar organization, all right, created by Evhen Konovalets. They created, in addition, UNO had a youth organization called MUNO. There was a women's auxiliary. There was a aid organization. All of this existed, but it was fortified many times over by the appearance of the League for the Liberation of Ukraine. And now these people had a very difficult time initially. I can relate to this very well because of my own father. My own father arrived in the United States, and this was similar to people like Dr. Roman Malashchuk, who was the first head or president of Liga Vyzvolenia Ukraine. They were released from a German concentration camp on May the 8th or 9th, 1945. They had been in Auschwitz longer perhaps than anyone because they were arrested in September, on September 22nd, 1941, taken to the prison in Lviv, in Loiskoho, Montepeluch, in Krakow. Then they were brought to Auschwitz. From Auschwitz, when the Soviets came, they were fortunate enough to be able to walk and still function, even though my own father weighed 46 kilograms at the time that he left Auschwitz. And they had to march, and then they were put on a train. They were put on Mauthausen, then Ebenze, and finally they were released by the Americans, fortunately, not by the Soviets, because had they remained in Auschwitz, they would have been liberated by the Soviets, which would have meant sending them to the gulags. But nonetheless, the Soviets prepared, for the benefit of Americans and for the benefit of Canadians, a list of organizations that were, it's called, list of organizations considered inimical to the United States. Anyone who was affiliated with any one of these organizations was considered a fascist collaborator. There was the Office of the Ukrainians in Germany. There was the Ukrainian Youth Committee, this is SUM, okay? There was a Ukrainian Military Association, which was then formed into the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. The Ukrainian National Association, they write, however, in paragraph they have ООН, Организация Украинских Националистов, Ukrainian Aid Committee, and finally, last but not least, I suppose, the 14th Galician Waffen SS Division. In any event, primarily these two organizations that very often they were competing against each other, the UNO and the Liga. They were often, and the Soviets would write articles about their acrimony and about their internal fighting, and about the way they created the World Congress of Free Ukrainians. There was an article about the Congress, I don't know whether many of you are old enough to remember. In 1973, there was a Congress of the Ukrainian, World Congress of Free Ukrainians in Toronto. I remember as if it happened today. Mr. Bilak was the chairman. We couldn't agree on anything. The hotel was turning off the lights, but we had to elect someone. So they split the difference and chose, they split the term. Plavyuk was elected for 2.5 years, Bazarkov for another 2.5 years, and that's the way they went on. And the Soviets wrote an article about this, and there's a pamphlet that came out. It's called Ahala Subulo. There was so much noise, and there was so much noise. They finally got it right. But the fact of the matter is that they politicized this community to such an extent that it became a real diaspora in the sense of doing what is good for the country back home and the people back home. Political activity, lobbying, influencing your various members of parliament, members of Congress, and that was the thrust. And there was no denying what their purpose was, and that was to lend assistance to Ukraine. I realize that my time is almost up, Orest, and I will conclude, but I wanted to give you, perhaps it's a revelation, because it was a revelation for the people in the United States when I revealed this. TUAC, or whatever that organization that existed in Canada, it still does, right? There was a lot of ambiguity about where we are and where we're going. In 1920, now you've all heard of a gazeta called Svoboda, right? Published by the Ukrainian National Association. The president of the Ukrainian National Association, when I revealed this to him, he was not only a guest, there were two editorials written, one in Svoboda, the other one, Ukrainian Weekly, about how much of a liar I am. This was this year. But the fact of the matter is that there was an article that in that Svoboda in 1920, which said list zі старого краю. This is in Ukrainian. I'm not going to read you this, but in any event. And then there was a redakcyjna primitka, an editor's note, which was in response to that article. And Svoboda wrote, in fact, that if the only movement in Ukraine is in favor of revolution, which is in favor of revolution, is the Bolshevik movement, then we support the Bolsheviks. Okay? So, in conclusion, the significance of this third wave was that they essentially focused all of the work of the Ukrainian community. There was a Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, which was created, I believe, in 1941. Initially, it was called the Ukrainian Congress Committee. There was a Ukrainian Congress Committee of America as well. But the focus, the political focus, clear as day, striving for a free and independent Ukraine, which was anti-communist and anti-Russian. Anti-Russian is very important because during the Cold War, America became very anti-Soviet, but America was pro-Russian. America insisted that we include Russians among captive nations. Now, it's obvious how that worked out, right? I'm suggesting that the focus of anti-communism and anti-Russians and in favor of an independent Ukraine was not created because that idea came from organizations like UNO and others. But the focus, the final focus, came from that third wave, which arrived after the so-called fascists and neo-Nazis. I'll give you an example of a fascist and a neo-Nazi. First Hulava of Liga, Dr. Malashchuk. He spent 3 years in Auschwitz as a prisoner. That's how he collaborated. Then they took him to Ebenze. He was finally liberated. He came here, and the Soviets started spreading news about the Liga, that they were a bunch of neo-Nazis and collaborators. So, in conclusion, Mnoha Elita, Liga Українців-Канади.
My lecture is going to be slightly different from what Askell just presented. I'm going to try and give you an insight into why I have done what I have done with my life as a descendant, as is Askell, of that third wave, the wave of Ukrainians who arrived in Canada after the Second World War. So to do that, and reflecting on what I wanted to say tonight, I thought I would start with the beginning, my beginnings. A talkative fellow back then, at 2 years old, and a talkative fellow to this day. My foundations, what makes me what I am right now, has a lot more to do with how I was raised than I ever gave much thought to in the past. So if we look at the first slide here, is my christening in Kingston, Ontario. Now, of course, I'm not conscious of what's happening to me here at that time, but I'm actually being held in the arms of a woman from Velika Ukraina, as we used to say, from former Soviet Ukraine, a woman who survived the Holodomor and became my godmother, Nina Danea. I didn't know about the Holodomor. We didn't even call it the Holodomor then. But when I was a young man and going to high school, Nina would talk to me about what she had survived. And I would go to my teachers, and I had great history teachers, Mr. Goodrich, I still remember his name, and say, did you know about this famine that occurred in Ukraine? And he said, that's Soviet propaganda. And I would go back to Nina and say, why are you telling me lies about the Soviet Union? That's anti-Soviet propaganda. That's not true. And then she would sit me down and tell me more. And I'll never forget the day she told me about how she saw human flesh being sold in the market. When she died alone, I was in charge of cleaning out her home. And I'll always remember going into that very modest bungalow, her husband had predeceased her by several years, and finding that the kitchen cupboards were stocked with bags of sugar, flour, wheat, everything you could possibly need to survive for years. Needless to say, the local food bank was very happy with me when I turned it all over, but it gave me a sense of what she had survived. So when I think about this moment in my life, I was just a year old here, being christened in St. James Chapel, where I just recently held my retirement event, a kind of ceremony of reflection and thanksgiving. I also think of the man who is blessing me. This was Father Marko Stek, who some of you may know worked with Sheptytsky in Lviv during the Second World War, and who personally saved Jewish children from the Nazis, helped Jews survive the Holocaust. He's now one of the righteous among the nations, recognized by Yad Vashem. So in a picture here, in my very earliest moments, really, I'm being held by a survivor of the Holodomor, and I'm being blessed by a man whose bravery and whose faith carried him forward to eventually a life in Canada. Now, I knew Nina Denejo for most of my young adult life. I never met Father Marcos Stack, but when I did find out about who he was, I also found out what happened to him, and he died and was buried in Edmonton. And so after I discovered where he was, I made sure that there would be flowers on that man's grave. So this just happened a few weeks ago. It took me that long to figure out where he was. So I have this kind of early nurturing foundations. But where it really comes together is with my parents. And so they're not here anymore, of course, but I have to pay attention to who they were and what they made me. Now again, my mother predeceased my father, and I remember one day when he was alone and feeling lonely, I said to him, I asked him a question I'd never thought to ask him before. Tato, how did you meet Mama? Right? Think about it. Tato, how did you meet Mama? And my Tato told me a fantastic story. He told me a story of how one day he was standing guard. He was a member of OMNI from before the war, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and through the war, of course, in Pipilia and Upa. And so after the war, sent west, standing guard over Bandera in Munich, not far from Zeppelinstrasse. And he said to me, well, one day I was in the English gardens at my post, making sure that no Soviet agents came near the headquarters, and I saw a pretty girl. I don't think that's what you're supposed to do on guard duty, but my Tato liked girls. And he said, and she would go by and I'd see her, and then the next day there she was again, and then there was another day, and I kept seeing her and thinking, could be a Soviet. I don't think that's what he really thought. But he said, I approached her and challenged her, and then we got to talking, and I found out that she was a typist in Zeppelinstrasse. And I said, you mean Mama typed for Bandera? He said, yeah. But she never knew that that was Stepan Bandera in the next office. That's how conspiratorial it was. And I said, Tato, come on, maybe you're making this up. He said, oops, sorry. Oops. Well, no, there he is looking at my mother typing in Zeppelinstrasse. So I come from, I'll say, good stock. They were very much committed to the cause of Ukraine's liberation, to the cause of returning Ukraine to its rightful place in Europe. Very much committed to the nationalist agenda that Askold has just spoken about. And so when I went on to do graduate studies, particularly my PhD, I wanted to study that third wave. And to study that third wave, I began coming to Toronto and meeting people here, including Dr. Malashchuk and many of the others, learning about their activism and learning about what they had tried to achieve in the immigration. It was very clear that for the third wave, some of you, or your parents or your grandparents, the abiding interest these people had was in the cause of Ukraine's liberation, of Ukraine's freedom. That was what their activism was all about, and I think it was very nicely captured in this particular photograph that I would eventually use for the cover of the book, Searching for Place, which you'll see at the back if you want it later, political activism. Now, when I was working on that PhD and then looking for photographs, I asked the Hromada for photographs from those DP camps. And I got a lot of photographs of people at church, in a meeting hall, in a mess hall, walking around in the courtyards and so on. But what I was looking for was political activism. And believe it or not, despite the fact that I had reached out to literally dozens, if not hundreds of people looking for photographs of political activism, I hadn't found any until one day a friend of mine from Calgary said, hey, Lubomir, my buddy's dad just died in Winnipeg, and he found some little black and white 2x4 photographs. Would you like to see them? You might be interested in them for your book. And I said, sure. I was giving up. And the envelope arrived, and I opened it, and I found this photograph. And as you can see, there are a whole large number of Ukrainians condemning communism, talking about forcible repatriation, signs in English and Germany. This was in Munich in 1949, April 1949. And I said, wow, that's definitely a photograph I'm going to use for my book. And that's the book that's back there, Searching for Place, Ukrainian Displaced Persons, Canada, and the Migration of Memory. Well, what made that photograph so powerful for me, so take a good look at this picture, was what I saw when I first opened the envelope and pulled that little photograph out. There in the front row is my father. He had no idea he'd been photographed. No, he did not know Bogdan Selinsky, who took the photograph, and there it was. Wow. Like serendipity, you call it what you want. It became the cover of my book. I wanted to portray that activism because of what my father and my mother had taught me. And as I've said to you, I was born in a very small community of Ukrainians. Many of you know Kingston, Ontario, 250 kilometers east of here. The community there, the Ukrainian community, was always small. Perhaps 20, 25 families of that so-called third wave. Some people who had been there from the interwar period with whom we had reasonable relations during sort of church and this sort of thing. But the core community I grew up was the DPs, the displaced persons. It was small, but inside, internally, was quite diverse. So we had veterans of UPA, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, from Volyn, who were Pravoslavny, and Melnikivchi. And then you had my father, the Banderevich, from Halichina. And you had people like Nina Danaha, who was a survivor of the Holodomor. You had forcible workers, people who had been forced into work in Germany. You had people who had joined the Divizia Halichina. You had all sorts of people, but because there were only a few of us, we all had to work together. I do not honestly recall ever hearing in my community, Melnikivich, nobody talked about that. We knew it, we were aware of it, but in a sense, because I grew up in such a small place, we all had to work together. And so the Kingston branch of the Canadian League for the Liberation of Ukraine, which was originally actually just called the League for the Liberation of Ukraine. They added the word Canadian to make it more palatable for the authorities. The Kingston branch of Liga was actually formed in my parents' home on Nelson Street in 1953. Literally founded in the living room. And according to family lore, and I cannot prove this, in that same living room, when I was just a young boy of 2 or 3 years old, Guzenko, Ihor Guzenko, the famous Ukrainian who left the Soviet embassy in Ottawa and, in a sense, revealed Soviet spy networks in North America and started the Cold War, I'm told Guzenko bounced me on his knee. I don't remember that. So in that very small community, this was what we were. This was who we were. This was all we were. You can see up there, sort of circled in the pink, is my mother holding me. Down below here, a few years later, 1959, I'm the little lad here holding the flag, greeting Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. We were a small community, but we worked together. Now, that was the sort of formative years of my life. And I'm going to be very honest. And when you look at me today and you go, how could that be? Look at him, he's doing all this stuff. I hated it. It was too political. Most of the kids in that photograph abandoned the community, left it. And I did too. I had a Ukrainian Catholic priest, Father Ryot, who became a good friend and a mentor to me, who took me away from the Ukrainian community and gave me an opportunity to work as a field biologist for the Royal Terror Museum at Chaffee's Locks, the Queen's University Biological Research Station, for several summers. I was able to leave the community and do something that I wanted to do, work with insects, for him, and also work with reptiles and amphibians, which I loved. I wanted to be a herpetologist. When I went to university, I was a biologist. I was interested in quaternary geology. I was interested in newts and salamanders. I was running away. I was the prodigal son. I found everything too political, particularly because of what I experienced not far from here at Camp Vesalka, Camp Rainbow. No rainbow when I was there. It was a place that I found very difficult to get along with. I'm the little guy sitting there circled in the middle. I was part of a group of people who I didn't understand. My Ukrainian is not good, was not good, because I had no school. I had no Ukrainian school. I learned what Ukrainian I can still speak on my mother's knees, because we just didn't have the capacity to teach. And then they sent me to Camp Vesalka. And Camp Vesalka was not a place that I found particularly agreeable. Although I remember that's where I found my first crayfish, and I did like that. That was in what they called the pool, which I believe would normally be called a swamp. So I left. And yet, what's he doing up there now? Well, I came back. Why did I come back? And again, this had something to do with the fact that I was given an assignment by my MA supervisor in the Department of Geography at Queen's University, Peter Goheen, who is still alive and still a good friend. He said, for your MA, Lubomir, you will study the historical geography of Ukrainians in Kingston. And I said, no, I won't. And he said, yes, you will. Now, I know for the younger people in the audience, you can say anything you want to your supervisor, but in those days you listened. And so out I went with my tape recorder and began interviewing Ukrainians in Kingston. I thought, how boring interviewing my parents and their friends. But then I started to discover lots of things. I discovered that the first Ukrainian domilka in Kingston was a communist domilka, the Ukrainian Labor Farmer Temple Association. I discovered that some of those people were still alive, and I talked to them, and they were interesting, although they were terrified of me because they thought I was RCMP. Right? My father, the Banderevich, had to go, I'll always remember this, to Mr. Turkevich's business with me to vouch for me that I wasn't RCMP. Я є Banderevich, ти комуніст, він є RCMP. They could agree on that. Bizarre. I started discovering the other sides of our community that Askold has referenced. I began hearing about the Ukrainian-Canadian men and women who had volunteered for overseas service during the Second World War. People like Bogdan Panchuk, his wife Anne Chernyelsky, Anne Khrapliva, Tony Yaramovich, and others, who were the descendants of the pioneer settlers, who were the descendants of the interwar immigration that's been referenced. I began understanding that it wasn't just the third wave that were patriotic. Very important. Because I was still in this sort of Kingston world. I hadn't gone out to Edmonton yet. We'll come to that in a minute. So I began coming to Toronto and talking to other people, to Hitmanchu, to the communists. I didn't like them, I'll be honest, still don't. But I talked to them. I learned from them. And one of the people who was formative in my young adult life, I've already sort of come away from my parents, now I'm doing graduate studies and I'm doing it under the auspices of the university, so I'm kind of being the intellectual, the academic, I'm not engaged in politics. And then I met Andriy Bandera. I met Oleg Romanishin, I met Dr. Malashchuk, I met others, but I met Andriy Bandera, who was the editor of Ukrainian Echo, or Home in Ukraine, but the English version. Andriy, for some reason, took a shine to me. His name for me was Leiduch. Somehow fits. I spent a lot of time talking to Andriy about the Hromada, about the Soviets, finished my MA, went to the University of Alberta and began studying the third wave, and so stayed in close touch with Andriy for several years until I returned in 1984 to the Department of Geography here at the University of Toronto. By then I'd had the sense that there was a kind of a double standard in the academic world that I was twisting and turning in. I had realized that I actually wanted to be a political geographer instead of a herpetologist. So I had made that move. I'd found enough interesting about Ukrainians in Canada that I wanted to study them. And Lasha Hichi and I are very proud that our daughter is now studying Ukrainian-Canadian history. But as I was delving into that and standing with Andrei many a time and speaking about it, I realized that a lot of my academic friends were all in favor of national liberation for this country or that country. They were all in favor of all sorts of struggles for independence, except for the struggle of the captive nations of the Soviet Union. No one was interested in Ukraine. No one wanted to hear about the dissidents, the human rights activists, much less about the fascists, etc., of World War II. And so I began to get angry at my predominantly sort of academic left-wing friends who talked about apartheid, talked about the liberation struggles of this country or that, but wouldn't talk about Ukraine. So I came back to the University of Toronto, began teaching, and then Andrei did something I'll never forgive him for. He died. Now, I keep a diary. I have since I went to graduate school. It's up into the 150 volumes now. I write in it almost every day. And when I was preparing for this talk, I thought, I'm going to say something about this man, Andrei Bandera, and what I wrote about him on the day he died. I wrote many pages, and I'm not going to read you many pages. But this is literally what I wrote on that day. Dear Andrei, I thought you might like to have my reactions to your funeral. Possibly you already have these, since I can imagine that if you would have looked in. I doubt it's likely, but who can tell from where I am? Or maybe you would have, but you were too busy chatting with your mother and your father. There must have been a lot to talk about up there. Anyway, the first thing I want to tell you is that your son, Stefko, did you proud. He was controlled, serious, yet charming. You always carried the deep pain that came from losing your father so early in life and in such tragic circumstances. The legacy continues. He is his father's son, as you were yours. I hope you understand the need our people have for this continuity. I guess you did. Don't let me forget about the motorcade. I would guesstimate that some 300 cars took place in your funeral drive out to the cemetery. Motorcycle policemen escorted the procession, which caused many a minor, if temporary, traffic jam in downtown Toronto. I drove along with Rusty Soderway. As we drove along, a mustachioed driver of a car going in the opposite direction asked us, who's this funeral for? And what could I say? For a friend, a leader, a newspaper editor, a father? So I rolled down the window and I said, for a good Ukrainian. I guess that sums it up best. You were nothing less, but little more. That's enough, by the way. I'm not sure what I am. I was not near you long enough for you to help me figure it all out. You're still around, but the conversation is all one way from now on. I hope I get your answers right. I'll try to do my best for the cause we both believe in, but don't be too cross with me if I don't always understand things as well as you did, or live up to the expectations you have of me. I'll try to do what I can, Andrei. I promise you that. I owe you that. Well, this is getting long. I'll end by recording what I said to the box as they encrusted you with it and as I passed by and dropped a blue iris on your coffin, and as cheerfully as I could, paid you a comradely goodbye. See you around, Andrei, sooner or later. Your friend who will always be just that, you will met. Andrei changed me. He was the first person who said, you've got a talent for writing. You should write for the newspapers. He gave me the opportunity to write for OMNI Alberta. He corrected me. He taught me that craft. I still do it. I used to be known as Victor Rozroma or Ivan Britva. Those are my pseudonyms in case anybody is recording this and you want to track me down. So Andrei changed my life, and then he left. But there was another man he left me with, Stanley Froelich, Captain Stanley Froelich here in 1946, crossing the Atlantic to Europe. Bogdan Panchuk, who worked with him, called him the playboy type. They had some tension. Froelich was from early pioneer immigrant stock. His father was a miner who worked in Hillcrest, Alberta, was there for the Hillcrest mine disaster. He wanted his son, although he was a gruff man, wanted his son Stanley to become a Ukrainian patriot. So a pioneer settler miner in Western Canada sent his son to Halachana in the interwar period to be with his uncle, a priest, where Stanley Froelich learned about and joined OMNI before the split. And when the Soviets came to Halachana, Stanley Froelich walked across the Soviet Union all the way to Vladivostok and took a ship to Japan, rescued in the final bits of his journey by a Jew who was also fleeing, who gave him the money to take the boat. And then Stanley came back to Vancouver, made his way back to Toronto, and as a young Ukrainian nationalist joined MUNA, or the youth branch of the Ukrainian National Federation. Why do I say this? First generation, or first wave descended nationalist patriot who joins UNO, which was then affiliated with OUN. But when it becomes clear that UNO is becoming pro-Melnyk, Froelich is tossed out. And he is the one, as a Terenovi Providnik of OUNB in Canada, who sets up home in Ukraine. And Stanley Froelich became a good friend. He was one of the founders of the League for the Liberation of Ukraine, and later what becomes the Canadian League for the Liberation of Ukraine, and then changes its name finally to League of Ukrainian Canadians. By the way, as Orest will confirm, that's the name I gave them when we had to sort of change the name. So, just as I'm coming back to Toronto, I've become involved in the nationalist cause, if you like. I've come back to it as a prodigal son. Then Andriy dies. Stan Froelich lived for several more years. I helped him with his memoirs. What do we get? We get the Commission of Inquiry on War Criminals, headed by Mr. Justice Deschênes, that I've spoken about before. Many of you have heard me on this. The investigation into the alleged presence in Canada of thousands of so-called Nazi war criminals, your grandparents, parents, perhaps a few of you. This was one of the most difficult periods of my life, but it was made bearable because I affiliated myself with a group of people who were involved with the Civil Liberties Commission, what became the Ukrainian-Canadian Civil Liberties Association. A non-aligned group headed by John Gregorovich, who was the son of a second wave pioneer who, by the name of Andrew Gregorovich, who was actually the founding father of UNO. So here I am, the Banderevich, if you like. In the middle is Mary Manko Haskett, a survivor of the internment operations, and Gregorovich. This is one of the causes we took up that you all know about, the internment of Ukrainians in the First World War. I became engaged with activism on behalf of all Ukrainians. During the Deschênes Commission, the position we took was that any war criminal found in Canada should be brought to justice, regardless of who they are, where they came from, their gender, their political ideology. None of that matters. What matters is if there's evidence of wartime criminality, that person should be brought to justice. We did that. People like John Gregorovich from UNO, people like Lyubomir Lechuk and others, many of whom were in this room, who worked together within UCLA. We raised the issue of redress because we began saying, wait a minute, there are episodes in Canadian history that represent injustices perpetrated against our people, and we need to get acknowledgement and recognition for that, and we succeeded. Now, since these days, we've, of course, political activism on the level of the federal level to getting all the way up to redress. We recognized also that some of the suspicions we had, and Askold made reference to this, about how the Soviets were manipulating tensions within our community, between us and other diaspora communities, particularly between Ukrainians and Jews in the diasporas. How this was being orchestrated by the Soviet Union and more recently by the Russian Federation. So we've now proven that. We found the documents, and I've talked about Operation Payback before. We now know that from the late 1970s, starting in the United States, Soviet agents of influence, as was already described, began promoting the notion that thousands of Nazis and sympathizers and war criminals had hidden in the United States. And they were so successful with that campaign that the government in the United States established the Office of Special Investigations in the Department of Justice and carried on its activities for a decade, causing great harm to the Ukrainian American community. And the Soviets were so delighted with that that they promoted the same story in Canada, and we got the Deschênes Commission. And this is now laid out black on white in Soviet documents that we have. So it's not LeChuck suspecting something, it's real. Now, when I was doing my MA and my PhD, one of the people I met was a man in Winnipeg by the name of Petro Bashuk. Mr. Bashuk was a member of OUN, a Banderevich, and he told me about something I'd never heard of before. He told me about the Druga Linia, the second line. And I asked him, I remember saying, well, what does that mean? He says, in our parlance, in our terminology, we are the second line. There are the people in Ukraine who are fighting for Ukraine's independence, the dissidents, the human rights activists, the survivors of the Gulag, the people who are still in the underground resisting Soviet rule. We are also out here in the West, and we're aging. And some of our children are following our footsteps, but many aren't. But we are nevertheless the Druga Linia, the second line. We are the ones who must stand in support of what the people of Ukraine are trying to do. And I always remembered that and thought to myself, well, okay, if we're Druga Linia, and I'm Zleidu, we should be working on all fronts to do what we can to support Ukraine. And so to the very end of my career, I was trying to do that. And one of the books that you can see back there, and here I am signing it in Chicago, is Enemy Archives. I wanted to pull together with my colleague, Professor Vietrovich, documents that the Soviets had about OUN and UPA, and put them out in English translation so the world that you and I live in, whether it's in New York or in Toronto, so that colleagues of mine, students of mine, could read for themselves what the Soviets knew about the nationalist movement and understand that there are myths and there are realities. And so one of the final products of my academic career, now finished as a retiree, was this book. I think it will illuminate who the nationalists were, who the third wave really were, for those of you who look at it. Now, today, of course, we are all very acutely aware of the fact that the Russians are waging a genocidal war against Ukraine and Ukrainians, a war that began in 2014 and which escalated in February 2022. It is part of Russia's long-standing imperial project. It is part of Russia's settler colonial agenda. There's a very useful book, I'm going to nuance that, by Dr. Eugene Finkel that just appeared in the United States called Intent to Destroy. It is a very well-written book that demonstrates that the Russians have for over 200 years attempted to erase us, you and me. Now, where Dr. Finkel fails, I think, in the book is he brings the prejudices of a Soviet-born Ukrainian of Jewish heritage to his work, and so he writes about OUN and UPA in negative terms, but in a small, it's asides, there's not much of it, citing people like Per Rudling and John Paul Himka. That said, it's still a very good book because he demonstrates that we, the Druga Linia, whether you came in 1949 like my parents did, or are the children of those people, or they were your grandparents, we are still the target of Soviet-era disinformation and Russian propaganda being regurgitated today. And all you have to do is look at some of the recent controversies, the Hunka affair and all this, to know that that's true. So it's continuing, and it's getting more extreme. why would it be getting more extreme in the 21st century? After all, most of the DPs are gone. Okay? Most of the people who arrived in that third wave are dead. And yet, more extensive propaganda is being conducted now than I remember even back in the period of the Duchesne Commission. Why is it happening with such intensity now? I think I have an answer. It's because the Russians are losing the war. It's because the Russians are losing the war. How can I say that? How could I say that? You know, we're all aware of the grinding war, and they've given up this village, and they gave up this wheat field, and all that. Think back, all of you, think back to when you were young. Who knew about Ukraine then? Nobody. People told me there's no such thing. The ones that even heard us speaking, my mother and I speaking on a bus once, this is one of the few moments I can remember of discrimination directly targeting me, was an older woman, well, in those days, she must have been in her 50s, looking back in a bus at my mother and I behind her, speaking in Ukrainian, and saying to my mother and me, stop speaking your fucking foreign language. That's the only time sorry for the ugly word, that's the only time I actually experienced that kind of thing. But in those days, people didn't know what a Ukrainian was or where Ukraine was. Remember what you grew up with. And now think about it today. Never in human history has Ukraine been better known than it is today. Does anyone disagree with that? There's too much Ukraine. If I could be prodigal, I'd run away again. That's only a one-time trick. It's impossible to get away with Ukraine from thinking about Ukraine today. And that's because of one thing, and it's something you've done just as much as the people in Ukraine have done. There, they have demonstrated their valor in battle. Overall, our emigration has demonstrated and continues to demonstrate, and you do by supporting the kind of activities we'll do, is that Ukrainians never were Russians, aren't Russians now, and never will be Russians in the future. And so, the war against us continues and escalates. Against Ucrainica, and Orestetsiv and Olech Romanishin are owed a huge debt for the amount of work and effort they put into making sure that books and articles and material about Ukraine and Ukrainians continues to be published. Against Liga, against Sum, against Plast, against all of us of the third wave, UNO, all of us. We are all targets, as are our children and our grandchildren, and never forget it. I know the price I paid at the University of Toronto, and even recently at the Royal Military College on my way out the door for the activism that I've engaged in. So be it. Look around. We'll all be gone sooner or later, soon enough. But that doesn't really matter in a sense, because what I've discovered in my life was I dealt with the descendants of pioneer settlers, with the descendants of interwar immigrants, with, of course, many people from the third wave and their descendants. As we leave, as we step off the stage that we've been on for these decades that we're celebrating, there are those who are already stepping up to take our places. People who are coming now, part of the Piata Chwila, the fifth wave. I've seen it in Kingston, and I know you see it in Toronto. Now, they're not us. They're not. They never will be. But they stand for Ukraine like we stood for Ukraine. And that's all that matters. They are like, in many ways, the third wave, but they're different. They have their own agendas, but they stand for Ukraine. I think many of us can relate to the fact of what our parents and grandparents tried to do. And now, as I say, as we leave the stage, we have to turn it over to the new Chwili. And I never thought I'd say this, but Lasha's here in the audience, and she is the president of the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress. And I've been a critic of the Congress for much of my life. I have. And what is the motto of the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress? In unity, our strength. Damn right. Damn right. And I'm pleased to acknowledge that if they've done nothing else right, Cook got their motto right. And that's what we have to remember. We have to remember that we have to work with unity across the generations, across the immigrations, because if we're the Druhalina, we are standing in a support role for the brave women and men in Ukraine who are fighting and dying on the front line today. And as for me, I think I take a biblical quotation here. I think I can say I've fought a good fight, and I've finished my course, and I've kept the faith, and I'll say amen to that. Thank you very much for your attention.
We'll continue with our Q&A at this point. So I'll ask both speakers to stand close to the microphone. And ladies and gentlemen, please make clear which speaker you're referring to when you ask the question.
He's going to protect me, Lasha.
To небезпечно є.
Аскольд, я рада, що тобі дали розрішення приїхати до Канади. And Lupu, thank you for the somewhat grudging praise, but nonetheless, this is a question for both of you. We recently witnessed the, як я кажу, дно американської дипломатії в Білому домі. The performance of J.D. Vance and Donald Trump, which has shocked the world, but which has left Ukraine in a very difficult position. Arms are flowing, they're not flowing. Europe is deciding what to do. If the ostensible reason that Trump wanted a peace or wanted to resolve the war in Ukraine, that's the best I would characterize it as. He's done nothing but possibly drive the Ukrainians to more desperate means. The Chinese are now cozying up to the idea of perhaps being less friendly with Russia and contemplating at least the idea of some form of association with Ukraine. Well, can you comment on that?
Sure.
While the meeting in the Oval Office was shameful, in fact, I believe that it was an ambush on President Zelensky. I think that there is a silver lining, and the silver lining is already manifest. What has transpired since that meeting is that Europe has come together. Europe has allocated significantly more money and arms to Ukraine. They have been very clear in their disavowal of the position of President Trump. And with all due respect, I think that you take President Trump too seriously. He is not a leader of the free world or any world, all right? He's not even a leader of America. He just happens to be president because he was elected. Which means the following thing, that he is a narcissist, he has a lot of personal flaws, and he may be a Russian agent. If he is a Russian agent, and I don't have proof of this, I have circumstantial evidence, but not in a court of law, you're an attorney, we don't have sufficient evidence, and the reason why we don't have sufficient evidence is because there is no investigation, there is no indictment. If you go through the history of the United States, particularly the period during the Second World War, President Roosevelt went to Yalta in February of 1945 with his favorite advisor, who was Alger Hiss, who was an agent of the Soviet Union. Alger Hiss was not discovered as an agent of the Soviet Union until 1948, thanks to a colleague in the Communist Party named Whittaker Chambers. But what President Roosevelt did in Yalta, and subsequently President Truman simply continued that, and he had, once again, he had Alger Hiss as his, and the United Nations was essentially formed through the intercession of a Soviet agent who was working with the President of the United States. But there was no investigation. Alger Hiss was subsequently convicted for perjury because the statute of limitations had already run on being an agent. So we're never going to prove, I mean, we may, even posthumously, that Trump is a Soviet agent, but he very well may be. But he's a psychopath, with absolutely no doubt about it. What has transpired is that the world has organized around Ukraine. What has also transpired, and I think President Zelensky is a very smart man, President Zelensky managed to play him despite the fiasco in the White House. He went to the second meeting, he asked for a second meeting, he met, he agreed to a ceasefire. America agreed that they would start supplying arms to Ukraine again. They would share intelligence with Ukraine. And at this point, Zelensky knew very well what the response of Putin was going to be. But at this point in time, Ukraine is in a much better position, with the exception of Kherson Oblast. And that may be, there is also circumstantial evidence that the sharing of information, intelligence, was done specifically so that the Russians can mount an attack and eliminate that card, if you will, all right, because Zelensky couldn't understand that they were playing cards, because nobody can. People are dying, and this moron is talking about playing cards, and you have no cards in your hand. But be that as it may, the fact is that Ukraine is in a better position today because it will get arms from Europe. Europe, even Ursula has essentially spoken about $800 billion. The numbers that President Trump was bringing up, the $500 billion, is completely off the wall because America gave $118 billion, and it wasn't a loan. It was specifically aid, and it was appropriated by Congress, not by the occupier of the White House. He will never understand concepts like checks and balances. He's losing on every single front. So many judges have decided, he's won, I think, two cases, and all of his executive orders have gone nowhere. You have demonstrations all over the United States. People who voted for him, but now they've lost a ton of money in their stock portfolio. So my response is, as a Ukrainian, and I'm not a very good American, to be perfectly honest with you, because every time, and I'm not a good American because I rooted for Canada in that four country sweep. All right. But as far as Ukraine and the United States, if you give me another minute, has betrayed Ukraine so many times. Woodrow Wilson gave Halichina to Poland, all right? When the famine was going on in Ukraine, President Roosevelt acknowledged that and recognized the existence of the Soviet Union and exchanged diplomats. Then you had Yalta, you had Potsdam. Even my favorite American president, Bill Clinton, he tricked Ukraine into giving up its nuclear arsenal and the Budapest Memorandum. Then his successor looked into Putin's soul and said, I can do business with this bozo, right? My God, and Barack Obama, I'm a Democrat. Barack Obama, what did he do for Ukraine? He said, don't fight in Crimea, okay? All right, he said he didn't do anything for Ukraine. Joe Biden was working on helping Ukraine so that it wouldn't lose, but so that it would not win. So Ukraine has been betrayed by the United States so many times, but not like this. Because now we have a real chart in the White House. All right, but this chart is going to become completely neutralized by the American people. Because the people who voted for him will find out that he's bad for them.
A real legal.
I would have never guessed he was a Democrat. I think that the question about Ukraine and where it goes from here, look, I've written about this. It was in the Kiev Post. You can find it online. The Anglo-American world, by which I mean Great Britain, United States, Canada, was never interested in Ukraine's independence. If you look at the archival record, it's pretty clear. The British covered up what they knew about the famine at the time. The Americans recognized the Soviet Union at the height of the famine. The quotation that was read from Anglo-American perspectives on the Ukrainian question, the things you could read about what they had to say about Cook and Ottawa, about Stanley Froelich and others, all of this convinces me, after years of looking at these archives, that the Anglo-American world was indifferent, ignorant, and sometimes actively opposed to Ukraine's independence. Things changed a little bit in '91, and things have certainly changed since the war against Ukraine and Ukraine's escalated. We cannot deny that the United States, Great Britain, Canada, and many European countries have stepped up and have helped Ukraine fend off, to some degree, the invader, the historic foe. But what Ukrainians have failed to do, and I'm very blunt about this, they failed to listen to the Druha linia. I've said this before, and I've written about it in that article, that in November of 1991, several weeks before Ukraine declared its independence, I wrote an article published in the Globe and Mail, which you all know, the national newspaper of Canada, in which I argued that Ukraine should not give up its nuclear arsenal. And I was laughed at. Nobody's laughing now. They signed the Budapest Memorandum, and now they regret it. Because, why? They didn't listen. Bo вони що знають. Now, as much as I support Ukraine, you all know that, I wish they would listen sometimes. Ukraine has allies, the United States, Canada, Great Britain, that's fine. We call them friends. But Ukraine also has interests. And so Ukraine has to think about its interests first. Because, oh, Europe's stepping up. Yeah, the Germans stepped up twice in the last century, and I don't remember that went very well for Ukraine. And they were aided by the Italians and the Romanians and our friends, the Poles. Really? Really? Okay. So, yes, we have friends. Yes, these countries are stepping up. Yes, we should thank them for it. Remember, say thank you. Like my costume. But that said, Ukraine has interests. So in one of the articles in Kiev Post, you can find it, I actually say, perhaps it's time for President Zelensky to pick up the phone and call President Xi. And I didn't realize, as Askell just said, that there's new interests on the part of China, Lasha said, in Ukraine. But why not? They have interests, we have interests. The primary interest of Ukraine is survival right now. And who's the foe? Russia. And what does China want? Siberia. Seems like a fair trade to me. Muscovy can send them laborers. So maybe we should start thinking differently. And remember who some of our enemies are. At the United Nations, the United States voted against Ukraine, voted on the side of the Russian Federation and Belarus, and a group of countries that President Trump, the elected president of the United States, called shithole countries in Africa, including Haiti. And who else voted against us? Israel. And who got a pile of military aid and billions in defense money last week? 30 pieces of silver. So, you know, Ukraine needs to start thinking geopolitically. The primary purpose of the Ukrainian state is to survive, to keep the Ukrainian nation alive. That may mean one day you have to deal with this person, one day with that person. Sometimes they're friends, sometimes they're even potential foes. But you have to deal with them, and Ukrainians need to learn this. And fundamentally, and here's where I think Askol was perhaps hinting at something, and I've written about this, Ukraine needs to rebuild its nuclear arsenal. That's the only guarantee.
Gentleman at the back.
Alexander Menko, thank you so much for your thoughts, very insightful, and I would like to probably continue on what Pani Lesa was asking about. So I am a person, first wave, came to Canada 10 years ago, working in the artificial intelligence field, and yeah, as you said, these days we have to be creative after what happened in the White House. And one of the ideas that we are kicking around is my Ukrainian colleagues, and that's what I would like to give you advice about. So there is a field of the AI, artificial intelligence, called war games, simulation modeling of military battlefield operations they try to model. Of course, we cannot model the future, but why not to try? So we are kicking around the idea, like if you look on CNN, so they were like millions of people watching these war games of China against Taiwan and stuff like that. So we're thinking about, can we do a simulation modeling of what would happen if Ukraine wins and what Ukraine loses? Try to create quite a nice image of that and try to popularize it on the media and basically try to convince people that this is really a really worst case scenario if Ukraine loses and try to create an image. Of course, we cannot model the history, we cannot model the future, but some people believe in Kyiv in 3 days, so why not to believe in this big picture if Ukraine loses, try to show it that it's not really in the best interest of the ordinary Americans, ordinary Europeans and stuff like that. So what do you think about this idea? Does it make sense to do it? Yeah.
I'll do it. I don't think about
Okay.
Let me suggest and let me tell you straightforward. I know very little about AI. I'm 73 years old. All right. Technical issues are a little bit beyond me. I do use a computer, but there was something that you said, and Lesha started, and Lubomir mentioned, which is very, very important. In politics, there is no such thing as friends or likes, dislikes. There are only common interests. Poland, let's take Poland, for example. Poland is not, if you ever go to Poland, and in order to go to Ukraine, you have to go through Poland, you will meet many people who can't eliminate that age-old, for some reason, despite the fact that they invaded Ukraine 3 times and we never invaded Poland. They will never like Ukrainians, but they understand that Ukrainians are a buffer between, Ukraine is a buffer between them and Russia. I can't understand at the Rzeszów airport, there are 12 Patriot missile systems standing at the airport. Nobody's bombing Poland. These are American systems, right? They perhaps would have to get the permission, but big deal. What's America going to do? Withhold aid to Poland if they release some of those Patriots? There are only 5 Patriot missiles, Patriot systems. And they're running out of interceptor missiles. What the hell are they doing in Rzeszów? You have the same thing with other countries. I'm not suggesting that there is a thought, or perhaps more than that, a premonition, that Russia will not stop at Ukraine, that Russia will go on. Okay, I have a personal opinion on that, which is, I don't believe in that. I believe that Russia wants, but I'm not going to say that to my American friends, that Russia wants Ukraine because Russia is nothing without Ukraine. Moscow was formed or found by a Ukrainian prince in the 12th century. Kyiv dates back to the 5th century. 5th century, Kyiv was founded. That's 7 centuries apart. Christianity came to Ukraine, okay, and then it was brought to Russia. Even that entire concept of the Moscow Patriarchate came from Ukrainian metropolitans who are zradniki, all right? But the fact of the matter is that Kiev and Rus represents the entire history of what the Russian Empire would like to be. But we have to convince Europe, and the fact that Putin acts like a psychopath, it's very important. He is a psychopath, but a lot of the stuff I believe is faked, all right? The fact that he, people say he's dead, there's a lot of stuff going around. Now, there was an article today that said that he is terminally ill. And a lot of this stuff is true or not true. It seems to me that it's the same Putin that we see on screen. He hasn't died. Somebody said that there was a substitute, a surrogate acting on his behalf. Be that as it may, whether it's Putin today, there will be another Putin tomorrow. Because Putin did not make Russia. Russia made Putin. Russian mothers are Putin. They teach their children to die for the empire. Of course they cry, but this is an imperial state of mind. Completely, everything that they have ever acquired was by invasion and occupation. Their culture, everything that they had, the beginnings, that's why they need Kiev and Rus. That's why, but we can't say that. We have to convince the Europeans that they are next. We have to convince Poland, що Польська є в небезпеці. You have to convince the other countries, okay? You have to convince Germany. Europe finally, there are 750 million people in Europe. 750 million people. The United States only has 330 million. Russia has 150 million people. You're going to tell the GDP of the European Union is greater than the GDP of America. Per capita is another story, of course, because per capita America is richer. You're going to tell me that a military the size of Europe's potential, the largest army in the world today, I'm not talking about authoritarian regimes like Red China or North Korea, is the Ukrainian army today. Ukrainian is only 40 million people. There was an article, I'm just going to say, I'm going to conclude with this. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal. We were doing a Shevchenko Sviato in New York last week, and I was giving a speech, and that particular day, I read an article in the Wall Street Journal. They went to Pokrovsk, and they did an interview with a girl named Oksana. Oksana was 21 years old. She was skin and bones, but she was the commander of a drone outfit, regiment. Zhinka, okay? She had been wounded previously because she was infantry, but now she's fine. And they were speaking with her, and she said, well, I'm a soldier today. I've been a soldier for 3 years. My kochani, my fiancé, was a soldier. But we really are poets, because you know that this is the land of Taras Shevchenko. We're all poets. My job, however, is today to protect, defend my country, and to secure my fiancé's poetry, to save it for posterity. Everybody in Ukraine is fighting. Lubomir mentioned second line. My God, we really, in order to be a second line, we really need to wake up, because frankly speaking, we're not doing enough. Okay? Almost every Ukrainian is a volunteer. Ukrainian women they're everywhere. They're fighting, young women, and we need to be a little bit stronger. That's why I'm never satisfied. I appreciate what the third wave has done, but I'm not satisfied. And I'm certainly not satisfied with the fourth and the fifth wave. Unity is very important, but as Lubomir said, but we need to really unify and get them more involved. because I frankly think that the fifth, or the fourth, I suppose, is the one that came during the Cold War, right? And the fifth is the one that just came from Ukraine. There are, I don't know about Canada, but we have more Ukrainian immigrants that came to America, Ukrainians, that came since the war started in Ukraine, than came after the Second World War. We have more, okay? So, I mean, our churches are full because they were getting empty, all right? So, отець парох є задоволений. Але то замало, щоб отець парох був задоволений. We have to get all of these people involved, and today, we have to convince everybody that it's in their interest. Even Zelensky was saying, despite the fact that you may have an ocean protecting you today. But the war is today's world is so entirely, one Osama bin Laden murdered 3,500 people in New York. All right? You're going to tell me that a Russian force cannot attack the United States? America's everywhere. That means they can be attacked everywhere. Okay? Look at the situation close to the North Sea, which happened a couple of days ago. An American oil tanker, a Russian captain who was arrested for the attack. Come on, the ocean is no buffer any longer. That's why no matter where you are, you're not safe from Russian imperialism. Russian imperialism is, I can't believe I'm going to say this, I didn't vote for presidential candidate Romney when he said that the greatest threat to the world today is Russia. He said this, and I stupidly voted for Barack Obama. But then, I'm a Democrat, so what are you going to do? Sorry. I think there's other
questions? Yes.
As someone, and there are many people in the crowd that have been helping the Army since 2014, I'm wondering what the panelists have to say about designation in terms of aid, because Oscar just finished saying we're not doing enough. Where's the direction to say 80%, 75%, 90% needs to go to defense, and the rest can go to cultural events, etc., etc. I haven't heard that direction from the community at large, and I think that's a problem. And this is to Lubomir. Did we miss a chance to rehabilitate the image of the Divizia by showing how barbaric the Russian army was and the desperate situation that the Ukrainian army was in, that would have taken help from Gitko Samoho, and hence the parallel to the Divizia during the Second World War? Did we miss an opportunity to rehabilitate the image of the Divizia?
Well, just on the Divizia Halachna, on the Galicia division, I mean, you can read the little booklet back there. The controversy that was stoked up about a year and a half ago over Hunka appearing in the House of Commons was clearly to our detriment. It was clearly well managed by those who stand against us and against Ukraine. It has not concluded. There are still stories appearing about it. Hunka has become kind of a symbol for the Nazis hiding in our midst, even though we know he's innocent of any wrongdoing. There's no evidence he did anything wrong. Being a member of the Galicia Division was long ago found not to be grounds for prosecution of any kind by the Government of Canada and others. I think that one of the problems, if I can talk also a little bit about the aid issue, is most of us like to get an income tax receipt when we make a donation. And you can't make donations to provide military equipment to Ukraine. So a lot of people simply will give to many of the good foundations that exist that are providing humanitarian relief, supplies, and so on to Ukraine because they get the income tax receipt. Now, I know there are people in this room who collect money for the Ukrainian military and make sure it gets there. And I admire those people, but they cannot do that quite as openly as, say, any of the traditional foundations work. You can't expect Kook to say, give us money and we're going to buy some Abrams battle tanks for the Ukrainian military. It's just not going to happen. That's a state-to-state function, or a very carefully controlled and far more modest function that can be performed by some individuals, including the men and women from Canada who volunteered to go fight in foreign legions for Ukraine. So people can do that individually, but it's not possible at the COOC level or World Congress level. Just, it can't happen. And so I echo what Askold has said. We can all do more. We can all do more. But we also have limits, right? So I think the best thing we can do is to speak to our politicians, speak to our media, get engaged in the political process, and pressure our elected officials to do the right thing for Ukraine. And in the meantime, if I could just, since my American friend here has picked on the United States a bit, and I think with good reason, I'm just going to say, like, God bless America, because who else would you want as a neighbor?
I'd like to address very specifically, that's a very important question. And I'm very heavily involved in, excuse me, let me finish this question about aid. Theoretically, no 501c3 in America or not-for-profit or tax-exempt organization is supposed to supply military arms to Ukraine, technically, okay? But you can supply the following, and this is what I chair an organization that supplies currently nothing but drones to Ukraine. We purchase drones sometimes in the United States, but these are reconnaissance drones. These are not killer drones. But Ukrainians are very creative people. And you didn't hear it from me, but I've been told that take these drones, Ukrainians take the drones, and they put claws on them, and those claws carry bombs, and suddenly they become lethal drones. And another, oh, this is beautiful about Ukraine. Zelensky mentioned this at one of, Ukraine is the producer of probably the world's best drones today. Now, you may not be aware, but I go to Ukraine 3 times a year during the war, and I'm not going to tell you where these locations, where these factories are located. You've heard of ATACMS, right? America was boasting about the fact that they were enabling Ukrainians to shoot 190 kilometers from Ukraine. Well, these drones they've hit Kazan. You know where Kazan is? It's significantly further than 190 kilometers. They're called FPV drones. They're also called SITCH or SA. There are volunteers that you need to trust, but that's why you go to Ukraine, you meet with him, you find out where they've delivered, how they've delivered. There are благодійні organizations that you send them, they find the material, you send them the money. Now, obviously money is sending because you could be money laundering, of course, right? But you can use, there's so many banks, you know, one of my favorite banks for purposes is TD Bank, that's Toronto Dominion. This bank it's been under investigation for money laundering, but 3 times a week, I'm able to transfer, not large sums, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 to a particular regiment. For that $6,000, $8,000, that regiment purchases drones. FPV drones start at $400. They buy 10, 12 drones. These are regiments. You've heard of not only Kazan, but тепер вони вдарили біля Сочі. Українці вдарили an oil field. So you have to use creativity, and then you have to, I don't want to use the words of a Republican, but doveriyai ale proveriyai. Okay, Ronald Reagan said this. Ukrainians are not that, the country is not as corrupt as America makes it out to be, okay? All right, because there's more corruption. A few meters, 100 meters from the White House sits a hotel which is owned or leased by Donald Trump. All right, now that's corruption, okay? Putting your sons, your son-in-law's father into a position of ambassadorship, that's corruption, okay? Finding an attorney general who's going to do your vengeance, who's going to accomplish whatever your retribution, as you call it, now that's corruption, okay? Ukraine is, no, it's a little corrupt, but it didn't create corruption. Look at America. I invite you to, I don't know about Canada, you're probably as corrupt as America, all right? But we are awfully corrupt, America. We are awfully corrupt, okay? So you need to, there are ways, there are organizations that specifically, Ukrainian Free University Foundation, we are an organization which was created to finance the Ukrainian Free University in Munich. What we do today is we buy drones in Ukraine. And, sorry.
What's wrong if Ukraine is a neutral country? That is the border between Western and East.
Neutral country?
Like Switzerland.
I know, but they're not located where Switzerland is located.
But they can be a neutral country. There is no military.
So the question, okay. The question was, why can't Ukraine be a neutral country? It's a good question.
No, it's not.
I think it's a good question. I think all questions are generally good. Ukraine, as my colleague has just said, lives in is located in a pretty nasty neighborhood. The neighbors, all of them have been predatory, right? With possibly the exception of Belarus, if that's even a country. But everyone else in the neighborhood has taken chunks when they can. We all know that history. In 1991, I argued just what you said. Okay, be moderate, be neutral, but hold on to your nuclear weapons. In other words, like Switzerland, you can be neutral if you like, but you better well be prepared to be an iron porcupine that no one will ever try to swallow. Ukraine is now learning the hard way that without its own ability, indigenous, to defend itself, as has been described, one of the world's great producers of drones now and adaptive technology and so on, and AI, which was mentioned earlier, all of that is giving Ukraine the ability to defend itself, but it's coming in a time of war. So at this point, Ukraine can't be neutral. Now, could that possibly, President Trump has made it clear, Ukraine is not in NATO, it's not going to be in NATO, and he said that question was, he said it yesterday, the question was resolved 40 years ago. Which is odd, because in 2008, I remember hearing that Ukraine was on the path to NATO membership. Okay, they've been hearing that for all those years. How long do you have to walk to get into NATO? But they didn't push it. Because again, I remember Ukraine in the early 90s and the 2000s, and people didn't want to join NATO. They wanted to join the European Union, kostiumчики, и там вакации, and all the rest of it. They wanted to be part of the European Union because they could make money, but no one wanted to be part of, well, I shouldn't say no one, not many wanted to be part of NATO. Even after 2014, it only really becomes a major issue, I believe in the time of Poroshenko. So Ukrainians have only just woken up to the fact that they're in trouble, and in that context, I'm afraid, as much as I take your point, neutrality is not an option.
And why they kick President Yanukovych from Ukraine?
Well, they kicked him out because he was clearly taking a position of support for Russia away from Europe. Okay, sorry. We're not having a
discussion here. You ask your questions. And before, we never fix problems. If you want war, is going to be everybody dead. Do you understand?
Okay, sorry. Just the answer to that question was very simple. The people of Ukraine went out into the streets in the revolution of the Euromaidan, the revolution of dignity, because the president of Ukraine proved to be interested. Please, the president of Ukraine proved by his actions that he was going to betray his promise of taking Ukraine toward Europe, and instead changed his mind and started to move toward Russia. People came out into the streets, he deployed his thugs against them, and he was toppled from power, following which he immediately left with what wealth he could take to the Russian Federation. He left his mistress behind, I don't think she was happy, and went to the Russian Federation where he assumed Russian citizenship. This is not the behavior of a president of Ukraine. What did President Zelensky do when the war was imminent? He tried to negotiate. He did. He regrets it now. He didn't arm himself in time, so he probably will have to live with that one for the rest of his life. But the reality of it is, when President Zelensky was offered the chance to flee with his family and close advisors by the Americans, he said, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition." And that is the most important statement of the world of the war.
However, I have a few comments because I feel, I'm sorry, I feel skis. Two questions. First, Kravchuk gave up on nuclear weapons, not because he wasn't reading Canadian newspapers or listening to your arguments. In 1994, and Professor Plokhy would agree with me on that, because he specifically commented on that in Monkey School of Foreign Affairs, that Kravchuk and his government was forced to give nuclear weapons because for 2 years Ukraine was cut from any financial aid, any access to financial markets, and we were starving, and I know that from my own experience, we were starving, our salaries were like $10 to $20 per month, and people were not really eating enough, so in those situations, not having enough finances, not having experts in his government who knew a single clue on economy, how economy works in modern world, and more importantly, not having access to financial market to be able to regain finances and recapitalize the economy. At that situation, Ukraine was blocked from nuclear weapons. Another thought, I'm sorry, I have listened to you for 2 hours, and I want to comment. Another thought, nuclear weapons in the modern world doesn't save from occupation. You want to prove? Kursk Oblast. Kursk. Russia is a nuclear state. However, it didn't stop Ukrainian army from occupying Russia.
Okay.
And guess what?
So
I'm sorry, I haven't finished. Because I'm sorry.
Okay, China. Go ahead, China.
At least this community would listen to a few fresh thoughts, okay?
Sure.
Not just, because there's a huge sense of urgency in what's happening right now in Ukraine, and we are applauding to results that we've already achieved, but we are not at the victory yet. We are bleeding out as we speak. My husband is on the front lines, and I'm here for the few days trying to get as much attention, as much support of Canadian Ukrainian organizations to the program, to the Sky Shield initiative. Probably you read about that initiative in media last week that is well publicized.
Please ask your question.
I'm sorry, I know. You need 2 more minutes. Please be patient. Thank you. Sky Shield initiative, where we try to gain the momentum. The momentum is so-called post-NATO. There's no need to talk to Poles saying how scared they are. They already feel it. I've talked to many Europeans. I was in London, in Berlin. I will be in Brussels next week. They are all scared. It took just 2 speeches to disrupt NATO, because Europeans no longer believe that they will be protected, and there's an American rescue. So, to summarize that up, we don't need to call China. Please don't do that. You were raised up in democracy and dignity, and we have to fight 2 revolutions to get there. Don't call China, please. what we have to do as Ukrainians all over the world, as diasporas, we have to denounce.
It's Oris. It's fine. It's fine. Let her. No, proszę, dosia.
We have to unite European governments and probably Canada. And my biggest question to you is, if you see fit for Canada to be united, to be the part of that, in the coalition of willing, the countries who recognize the moment where they no longer are protected by America, but they can create their own security, and start what is known as Sky Shield to get the pool of their aviation to protect our western Ukraine and our main
Western part of Ukraine.
50% of the power generation as we speak, from cruise missiles. So my biggest question is, how about we focus on something that is a game changer in this war? Specifically this Sky Shield initiative, which was very highly supported by European and Canadian leaders. We have 80+ signatures of members of Parliament and today's ministers. So my biggest question is, do you see fit that now Canada actually recognizes that it can unite with Europe and create a new architecture of security for the modern world in this post-NATO era? Thank you.
Those were all excellent points, so I'm very glad the lady voiced them. Let me go through them one by one. In terms of, does nuclear weaponry protect your sovereignty? Ask North Korea. Or North Korea threatens the western seaboard of the United States, and American presidents, whether they're Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden, don't dare pick on North Korea. So frankly, yes, I think nuclear weapons are a deterrent. Kravchuk, 1991, I sat with him in a plane and I asked him these questions. So I actually spoke to the highest level of government at the time. I don't say he was a great president. And I mentioned this and was dismissed. Ukrainians by 1994, when they were signing the Budapest Memorandum, were fully aware of what they were giving up, because they were promised, or they thought they were being promised, that their political sovereignty and territorial integrity would be protected by the United States, by the United Kingdom, and by the Russian Federation. And we all know how that ended up. So they were fools. Now, President Clinton, who pressured, you're right, pressured the Ukrainians to accept the Budapest Memorandum, has recently said he regrets it. So the Americans understand that they did something wrong. I think that touches those. In terms of Xi, I think Ukraine has interests, and those interests go beyond friendship, go beyond, historical, cultural ties. Sometimes in war, you have to look for allies where you can get them, because that serves your interests. Sky Shield is not going to work because it's not been bought into. I've seen the plan, I've read the plan. In fact, I think you might have been the one that circulated it, or I certainly got it from someone just recently, and I read it. And protecting Ukrainian airspace, 50% of Ukrainian airspace, would be helpful, but you don't have that coalition of the willing. They talk about it, but they're all talking about America backstopping it, and America hasn't promised that. So yes, it's a plan that could potentially protect Ukrainian airspace, protect Ukrainian power grid and civilian infrastructure against Russian missile attacks, which tend to target civilian infrastructure and civilians. But I don't see anyone actually stepping up to endorse it. And as for Canada, as much as I had a long career associated with the Canadian military, many fine men and women serving in that, we don't have the resources. We may want to pivot towards Europe because of what's happened in the United States, but we won't, because we happen to live in the North American continent. And talking about how we're going to develop new ties and so on with England or the Great Britain and Western Europe sounds nice, but we're not going to do that if it means in any way weakening NATO, because that's still the best game in town, even though I agree with you, the statements by the American president have certainly meant or left many Europeans going, can we count on America? And the answer to that, frankly, no offense to my friend here, is no, you can't count on America. President Trump's been very clear about that. You can't count on America. And so what do? Well, you try to have new alliances, potentially. That's one thing you can do, coalition of willing, whatever you like. But we're in trouble. And you're right, people are afraid. We are now living in a more unstable world than we ever lived in for the past 60 years, thanks to NATO, which was originally established, as some will remember, Lord Ismay said, the purpose of NATO is to keep the Germans down, the Russians out, and the Americans in. And what Trump has done is take the Americans basically out, the Germans have been emasculated, and the Russians have been welcomed in. We're in trouble.
Let me just address. I wanted to address briefly the Budapest Memorandum. First of all, it was signed in December of 1994. It wasn't signed by Krawchuk, it was signed by President Kuchma. But be that as it may, what transpired is that there was, on the Ukrainian side, there was a misunderstanding. There were two versions of the document itself. One was in Ukrainian, one was in English. If you read the English document, you will not find the word guarantee. In other words, each one of the countries that signed, they gave their word that they would not attack Ukraine with their nuclear arms. But they did not guarantee that they would protect Ukraine from a Russian onslaught.
For those who don't know me, my name is Igor Kozak, and in my non-for-profit life, I am Vice President of the League of Ukrainian Canadians, amongst other things. And in that capacity, I had a pleasure and honor of working in Ukraine over the past 10 years with the Defense Forces of Ukraine, especially with those who conduct special operations. I also happen to be a retired military officer from the Canadian Armed Forces, and I was privileged to graduate from the Royal Military College of Canada, and I was more privileged that Professor Lyubomir Lytsuk was my professor at RMC. He was my mentor even before I joined RMC. He helped me to get into RMC, and he was my friend for over the past 25 years. Now, all of you obviously know that Professor Lytsuk dedicated his life fighting Soviet and then Russian propaganda, supporting all those good causes we all truly believe in. But probably not many of you know that he also does a lot of work inside Ukraine. For example, he was having closely working for years with historian Volodymyr Petrovich and many historians in Ukraine. He has also been lecturing in Ukraine, most lately at the National Academy of the Security Service of Ukraine. And I think this is it's paramount considering that these young boys and girls are graduating and straight going into the fight or on the front lines of fighting the Russian hybrid warfare in Ukraine and all over the world. Now, back in 2017, Lyubomir Lytsuk approached the League of Ukrainian Canadians with the request that he would like to travel to the front lines of eastern Ukraine. And he made a very special request that he didn't want a Mickey Mouse trip. He wanted a real deal. So, I mean, I arranged for him a real deal trip. I will not go into those details. You can read about it on the internet, but the long story short, Lyubomir ended up being in not only the front lines, but ended up being in the no man's land, and he happened to be in the middle of the firefight. And then he came back, he wrote a bunch of articles. The best one, I think, is in Jerusalem Post. You can still Google it. Now, fast forward from 2017 to 2025, and some of those young boys and girls, the activists, the special operatives, who were in their early 20s at the time, and they're still fighting for Ukraine in a much more serious role. And they learned that Professor Lytsuk was retiring from the Royal Military College of Canada in January of 2025 after many, many, many years of dedicated service to Canada, to the Canadian military, to the Royal Military College, to the academia. And notwithstanding being extremely busy, as you can imagine, fighting in Ukraine day in and day out, they wanted to recognize Professor Lytsuk as somebody they honor, they trust, they appreciate, value his work, and still work closely with him. And therefore, they asked me, and I have here to present, a special award for him. It's a medal, Znak Poshany from the Security Service of Ukraine, and it says here, для Lyubomira Lytsuka, for вагомий особистий внесок у посилення обороноздатності країни в умовах війни, виявлений при цьому високий патріотизм. So, I have a medal, I have a special scroll, and situation, it's somewhat unique, just think about this. You're having a Canadian citizen, retired Canadian military officer, presenting a professor of the Royal Military College of Canada with a special award on behalf of the Security Service of Ukraine. As the rule, those type of recognitions are being done by the official representatives of Ukraine, the Consul General or the Ambassador, but in this particular case, they specifically asked me to present the Bomber concerning our special relationship between him and I and the legal Ukrainian Canadian and those special forces, and they asked me on behalf of them and on behalf of all of you to congratulate him, to wish him all the best, good health, and to ask him to fight all the time.